I think antidepressants are giving people false hope, and a lot of people may feel better initially, but actually there will come a point when they realise, I've had the treatment that's supposed to work, it's not working for me, what on earth am I going to do? And that can put people in an even worse place. There are real problems out there in society that make people feel stressed and anxious and unhappy. And I think actually the people who are saying it's in your brain are the people who are making it less likely that we're going to resolve the problems that are making people unhappy and distressed and anxious in the first place.
My guest this week is Joanna Moncrieff. Now, Joanna is a psychiatrist and is perhaps the leading skeptical voice in the use of antidepressants to treat depression. She has written widely and she's appeared on a lot of media, and she's a controversial figure, and her latest book is called Chemically Imbalanced: The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth. Joanna, how would you change the world?
I would radically demedicalize our understanding and treatment of mental health problems. I think that understanding things like depression, anxiety, ADHD, etc., as if they are medical problems that arise from the brain is harmful to the individuals themselves. I don't think it leads to good outcomes. And I think it's harmful to society because it distracts our attention from what is actually making people unhappy and stressed in the first place. And so I would relocate help for people with mental health problems out of medical facilities, out of GP surgeries, probably to somewhere like social services, where they wouldn't be treated for their diagnosis, for their label, but actually helped to deal with the problems that had made them unhappy or anxious or stressed in the first place.
So you're not talking about just replacing drugs with therapy. You're talking about tackling the underlying causes of depression.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I do think therapy is helpful for some people in some situations, but I don't think it's a panacea. And I think the main problem is that we think of people who are depressed as having this thing called depression, and we treat the depression rather than helping the individual with their individual difficulties.
I mean, there are between 8 and 9 million people, we think, being treated for depression with antidepressants in Britain at the moment. And it's thought to be a growing diagnosis. Post-pandemic, big increase in mental health treatment. And what you're saying is, there's nothing biologically wrong?
Yes, I am saying that we haven't found evidence that there is a biological process that causes this condition, if we want to call it a condition.
What is the serotonin myth that you think you're correcting?
One of the biological theories of depression that was proposed several decades back now was the idea that depression is due to a deficiency of certain brain chemicals. And serotonin was one of the brain chemicals that was suggested to be relevant in depression in particular. So this is referred to as the Serotonin Theory of Depression. It was articulated by medical researchers back in the 1960s. There was a big project to try and detect abnormalities in serotonin and other brain chemicals that were proposed in the 1970s and 80s. They didn't find anything. The theory sort of fell out of favor in the 1980s, but then it was recruited by the pharmaceutical industry when they released the SSRIs in the late 1980s and early 1990s to help to market that range of drugs. And that's when this idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance became really widely known by the general public and featured in advertisements and on pharmaceutical industry websites and that sort of thing.
That is not an explanation that is used now for depression or for prescribing SSRIs, but you're saying that's still a common misunderstanding.
Well, I think that question has to be if antidepressants are not correcting a serotonin deficiency or some other chemical imbalance as they were initially said to be doing, then what are they doing?
That's a slightly different question. I mean, what I'm trying to tackle and to get into what you think is wrong with the way things are prescribed at the moment is, do you think people who go on to antidepressants still think that this is the reason? And what's your evidence for that?
I think there's an assumption by the medical profession as well as by patients that antidepressants work by targeting some underlying biological abnormality. And yet that has not been demonstrated. And there is another way that antidepressants work, which is not presented to patients and not widely acknowledged.
So, I mean, are you saying that SSRIs are a bit like alcohol?
Absolutely.
They change the way you feel?
Absolutely. Antidepressants are mind-altering, brain and mind-altering drugs like alcohol, like cannabis, etc. That doesn't mean that the effects that they produce are exactly the same as the effects that alcohol produces, but in principle, they do the same thing. They change our mental states quite subtly in the case of many antidepressants, but nevertheless, they do produce these changes, particularly this characteristic emotional numbing.
Isn't there something bigger here, though, about our whole approach to medicine, which is that too many people think that scientists really understand how medicines work? You know, we've got very used to just taking pills to make things better. And the truth is that a lot of it is just trial and error. We don't really know.
Yeah, I do think we put far too much faith.
We didn't know how penicillin worked for decades.
I think we can put too much faith in medical pronouncements or the pronouncements of medical research or neuroscience findings, and those can be overinterpreted. But I think that taking something, for example, for pain, people often cite the fact that we don't know exactly how paracetamol works, is different from taking something that is changing your mental state, like alcohol, as you say, and therefore changing your thoughts and feelings by changing your brain chemistry. We do that, like you say, we do it with alcohol. We recognize that, you know, if you take a lot of alcohol, you'll probably temporarily feel better, feel less depressed or less anxious. But we don't regard that as a sensible long-term solution to feeling low or fearful or something like that. And so I think that way that antidepressants are working, that those effects that they have need to be clearly explained to people so that they can make properly informed decisions about whether they want to take brain and mind-altering substances to address their emotional problems.
So you think there is no use for antidepressants, is that right?
So I think that the evidence base for antidepressants shows that they are probably not beneficial. They are minimally different from a placebo, and that difference is probably explained by the fact that people in these randomized controlled trials who are meant to not know whether they get the placebo or the antidepressant probably do know in a lot of cases, and that gives them that gives the people who are taking the antidepressant an amplified placebo effect. So I think that's probably what explains the small difference between antidepressants and placebo, but it's very small anyway.
I mean, just to be clear on that, the evidence is that there is an improved outcome for people on antidepressants, isn't there?
There's a slight
better
difference.
Than if you're just on a placebo.
It's slightly better.
Yes,
overall,
and your hypothesis is that people somehow know. I mean, what's that based on?
So there are trials where people have asked the participants to guess whether they're taking the antidepressant or the placebo. In most of those, not all, but in most of those, people can guess more accurately than would be predicted by chance what they're taking. And then we also know from some studies that what you guess you're taking has really quite a strong impact on outcome. It can improve your depression scores by quite a bit more than the difference between the drug and the placebo.
Isn't there a bit of a problem with surmising that because people are correctly guessing that they're on the drug rather than the placebo, that the drug doesn't work? You know, they are probably guessing that because they're feeling better.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's been proposed by people. The trouble is it's also been shown in negative trials where there's no difference between the drug and placebo, that people who guess they're on the active drug do better than people who guess they're on the placebo, regardless of what they're actually taking. But
I mean, I suppose that the summary position for you is that you don't think that the medical trial outcome, which shows that people are better off taking antidepressants than not, is sufficiently good for it to be scientifically sound.
I don't think that it justifies the mass prescribing of antidepressants. But another really important point is that we've assumed that what antidepressants are doing is correcting some underlying biological process that leads to the symptoms of depression. We don't have evidence of that. That's large. That was the paper that I did on the serotonin hypothesis was what sparked me writing the book. And there's another way that antidepressants might be working or might be having their effects when people take them for depression, and that is that they're not inert. They are drugs that change our normal brain chemistry, and by doing so, change our normal mental states, our normal feelings, thought processes, etc. They're not massively strong drugs in this respect, most of the antidepressants that we use nowadays, but they do induce feelings of emotional numbing. They numb people's positive and negative emotions, and they have been shown to do this in volunteers as well as people with depression. And of course, if you give people with depression a drug that numbs them a bit, that may be what's reducing their depression scores compared to placebo, as well as this amplified placebo effect. So I'm not saying that, it's possible that it might be that effect too. But I think that the decisions that people make about whether they want to take a drug for depression, if it's presented to them as something that changes their normal brain chemistry and their normal mental states, will be different from if it's presented to them as something that's going to target and correct some underlying abnormality.
Because one of the criticisms around your work is that you've created a straw man, an imaginary myth, which is this explanation around brain chemistry. When if you go on the NHS website or if you look up any of the charity websites, they're pretty clear. They don't actually say that. They don't say there's a problem with your serotonin, therefore go on one of the many common antidepressants that people know about.
So lots and lots of medical websites have told people that there's a problem in their brain chemistry historically. They have started to correct that over the last few years. Some have corrected it since we published the paper on serotonin and depression. But the thing is, if you don't tell people this other explanation, that these drugs are altering your brain chemistry and thereby altering your normal mental states, then people will assume, I think, particularly after all the promotion that's come from the pharmaceutical industry, persuading people that depression was a chemical imbalance, that the drugs are targeting some underlying abnormality. So they're being fixed. So I think, yes, exactly. So I think that unless people are explicitly told that, no, we don't have evidence that this is what the drugs are doing, then that's what they will assume that they are doing.
I mean, at the moment, antidepressants are doled out very, very easily by GPs who are not psychiatrists. How have we got into that situation?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there are a number of factors. I mean, the first is that the pharmaceutical industry has promoted antidepressants very heavily since the release of SSRIs in the early 1990s. There's GPs and psychiatrists have been deluged with advertising and promotional material. So that's one of the reasons. I think that another reason is that doctors want to be able to help people. And, what does a doctor usually do? They give you a pill, they give you a prescription. And psychiatrists in particular want to feel that they have a medical solution for a common mental health complaint, that is depression. And people themselves have of course, the idea that you could get rid of really troubling feelings with a pill is appealing. And so people have also been persuaded by that message that originally came from the pharmaceutical industry, because actually prior to the pharmaceutical industry's really strong campaigns of the 1990s, people were reluctant to take medication for depression, and they didn't, because
it was really scary medication, lithium and that kind of thing.
Well, it was partly because the benzodiazepines were so widely prescribed at that time, and it was becoming clear that they were dependence-inducing. So it was partly because of fears about dependence, but also people, I think, just felt that actually dealing with emotional problems with drugs wasn't the right route, and that depression was something that was a reaction to life circumstances, and so there should be other ways to deal with it.
I mean, patients ask for SSRIs now, don't they? People, they don't go to the doctor and say, "Can I? What can I do?" They'll say, "I think I need to take antidepressants." What should doctors be doing in that situation?
So I think there are some patients that come to doctors like that, but I think there are also many patients that come to doctors and are not sure really whether they should be taking a drug or not. And so I do think that the encounter with a doctor is an opportunity to demedicalize the situation and try and suggest other approaches to people. And I'm sure that lots of doctors do that. Of course, often people are coming to their doctors at a time of crisis and wanting something to be done, and the doctor doesn't want to send people away without anything. So there are all these pressures, I think, that do.
And our mental health services are on their knees anyway. So queues for treatment are extremely long.
And GPs are trying to deal with a lot of distress that mental health services won't take on. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So there is always going to be a temptation to say, okay, we'll try this.
There is. I mean, we do have a national therapy service now in the UK, and we're, unique to have one, I think, in the world, or one of the few countries in the world that has that. So there are other options. But, I know therapy doesn't necessarily start immediately, but people can be referred for therapy straight away.
Yeah.
It will start within a few weeks, the basic level of the NHS talking therapies service that's available.
But therapy often doesn't work, does it? People try it and it just doesn't help.
No, not always. But I don't think that antidepressants help either. So,
well, that's the problem, though, isn't it? Because millions of people are taking them, and presumably a lot of them feel that they are being helped. That it's working, and they don't know why, and they don't really care why. They just know that it's making them feel better. Otherwise, they wouldn't carry on taking them.
Yes, which is why we need to look at the randomized controlled trials and try and understand the results of those, and recognize that actually most of the effect of the antidepressant is a placebo effect. And a placebo effect, of course, is about having some hope that you will get better. It's not just about being duped that you're, taking something that doesn't really work. It is the hope that people get. The trouble is that I think antidepressants are giving people false hope, and a lot of people may feel better initially, but actually there will come a point when they realize that the antidepressant isn't working anymore, or they've still got problems. And then they can often feel even worse because they feel, oh gosh, I've had the treatment that's supposed to work. It's not working for me. I must be a really specially severe case. What on earth am I going to do? And that can put people in an even worse place.
Even if it was, let's say it's 75% placebo, why does that matter if it's not harming them?
Because it's reaffirming this idea that the problem is in your brain and that you need a drug to fix it. And we know that people who have that idea actually have worse outcomes than people who don't have that idea, who think that depression is a reaction that to circumstances. People who view depression in that way have a stronger belief that they can do something to help themselves and affect their circumstances.
But I mean, why do you think it's better to tell somebody that the problem isn't your brain, the problem is your mind, which is an even more amorphous, difficult thing to try and understand, and nobody really understands it? That really can feel hopeless, can't it?
I suppose it gives people more agency. If you locate the problem in the brain, then you need a medical, biological intervention to deal with it.
Yeah.
If it's to do with you and your life and your circumstances, then there are ways to change those.
But a lot of people don't feel they can change their circumstances. That's often the cause of depression, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And some people are in circumstances that are very difficult to change. I still don't think we have evidence that antidepressants help in that situation. And so
you don't think the evidence that so many people are taking it for so long is evidence that they are helpful?
I think it's evidence that they're unhelpful.
Just explain
that. They haven't. Well, people haven't.
Because I think most people would say, well, look, you've got 8 or 9 million people taking it. They're taking it for a long time. Most of them will say, well, they think they're feeling better as a result, which is why they carry on going back for repeat prescriptions and carry on taking the drugs. Isn't that effectively a massive clinical trial? So
what happens is people take antidepressants for a bit, maybe think that they are doing a bit better. And often when people start an antidepressant, I should say that, that they're at their lowest point, they feel they've got to do something about it, they go and see their doctor, and then they feel they have done something. So there's all those sort of factors operating that I think can help people improve when they first go onto an antidepressant. But So people will take an antidepressant, feel a bit better, think that the antidepressant has helped them, come off it, and then the next time that they get into difficulties, they will assume that they need a drug again. So they'll go back to their doctor, they'll get back onto the antidepressant. They might stay on it a bit longer this time, and when they try and come off it, they might experience some withdrawal symptoms, which can include anxiety, low mood, changeable mood, tearfulness. So often people will think that they're getting depressed again and and put themselves back onto the drug and not realize that what they were going through is withdrawal. And so people end up on taking these drugs for long periods of time. I think that's evidence, first of all, that they're not working, but also that people are becoming dependent on them and finding it difficult to get off them.
But I mean, again, the retort to that for a lot of people is going to be, well, whatever works, and if that works and gives me some sort of instant relief in a way that talking therapies don't, because they're very hit and miss, what's wrong with that? I can see your sort of your principled objection to it, but practically, we're in a world where the NHS health services are not good enough to cope with the demand.
I mean, I suppose I'm saying it doesn't work. I mean, there aren't a lot of studies on the long-term outcome of long-term use of antidepressants, but the ones that there are don't suggest that people who are taking these drugs long-term are doing better than people who aren't. And we know that there are lots of what we might call side effects or adverse effects of antidepressants that I think are probably going to be reducing the quality of life of people who are taking them long term. They include things like lethargy, insomnia, difficulty concentrating, sexual dysfunction, which is widely recognized. And then, of course, these problems with trying to get off the drugs if people want to try and come off them. A lot of people do experience withdrawal symptoms. For some people, these can be severe and really debilitating and can go on for long periods of time. And the sexual dysfunction can also persist for some people after they've come off the medication. This is something that's just come to light over the last few years, really.
So why do you think there are so many more cases of mental health crises being reported now and people saying that they are depressed?
So good question, I don't have all the answers. I mean, first of all, the public have been educated for decades now that negative emotions are medical problems and they should go and see their doctors about them. So I think it's partly that, and that education has come from medical institutions, but also been sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry partly. And I think it's also to do with factors in society. We've become a very competitive society, I think increasingly so over the last few decades. I think that's particularly affected young people, so that people are constantly, comparing themselves to other people and worried that they're not living up to standards. That, can lead to demoralization if people feel that they're not succeeding as they should be. It can lead to anxiety and stress, clearly. And for many people, life has got, of course, we've got a cost of living crisis, so life has become financially more difficult. Employment has become less secure and precarious. Housing, of course, is a huge problem. So there are lots and lots of social factors that I think give rise to stress among adults and younger people.
And do you think people want the diagnosis? Do people like being told, yes, you've got depression and you need to be treated?
So I think some people have come to believe that they have a medical problem and that a medical label would be helpful for them, whether it's depression or anxiety or ADHD or various other labels that people come to their doctors thinking that they might have nowadays. Of course, social media is playing a role in that. People look on social media at people doing videos saying, I've got this, I've got that, and think, yes, that might be me. So I think that's playing a role. I think people are desperately looking for explanations. And I think that's a reflection of people, of feelings of insecurity. People feel that they're, not performing at the level that is expected by someone.
I mean, it does feel a little bit, I mean, listening to you, it feels a little bit like you are basically saying it's all in your head. in a sort of academic-y kind of way?
So I'm saying that there are real problems out there in society that make people feel stressed and anxious and unhappy, and we need to address those problems. And I think actually the people who are saying it's in your brain are the people who are making it less likely that we're going to resolve the problems that are making people unhappy and distressed and anxious in the first place.
How realistic is it then, do you think, to try and treat 8-9 million people a different way? It would be tremendously intensive, wouldn't it, for the NHS?
Well, we have radically changed the way that we treat back pain, for example. We used to tell people to go to bed and rest up and take time off work. And now the advice is, to keep active and take gentle exercise. And the number of people off sick for back pain has plummeted. So I think that we can make large changes in medicine, actually. And I think that we could take a different approach to depression and anxiety and emotional problems. In fact, it's already started. We have there's social prescribing now in general practices, social prescribers who try and link people up with local social groups and institutions that might help them and support them with, loneliness and financial hardships and other problems that may be leading to mental health problems or indeed physical health problems. So we've actually have made a start. And what I'm saying is I think we need to take that further. I think we need to actually locate that sort of help outside of the NHS.
Do you think it means retraining GPs?
I think we need to support GPs to be able to divert people away from antidepressants, away from medical solutions into social ones.
And do you think GPs are too influenced by the pharmaceutical industry and the literature that they're constantly sent?
I can't speak for GPs specifically, but I know that the medical profession as a whole is influenced by pharmaceutical industry advertising. I go to conferences and there are, pharmaceutical companies with stands up everywhere and handing out leaflets and things like that. It's actually better than it was a couple of decades ago, I would say, but the influence is still there.
What kind of reaction have you had then over the years to your work? I mean, you're controversial, you're constantly criticised.
I think doctors, but particularly psychiatrists, are very reluctant to admit that their drugs are not targeting underlying biological processes, underlying mechanisms that produce symptoms or disorders, because they want to think that these drugs are more sophisticated than they are. There have been psychiatrists who I think want to shut down the debate about the serotonin theory of depression, about the biological origins of depression and the fact that there isn't really convincing evidence for them, in order to maintain this, what I would say, a misleading view that antidepressants and other drugs work in this targeted and sophisticated way.
I mean, you're also taking on Big Pharma. How do they respond?
Well, I haven't had any sort of personal contact with Big Pharma. I mean, actually, I think Big Pharma have largely moved on from antidepressants, and now the drugs that are being marketed are mainly drugs for ADHD. So they probably don't care that much, actually.
Is that your next crusade?
It might be.
I mean, why have you spent so much time on this? Because this has been many years you've been making this argument.
Yes. So because antidepressants are by far and away the most commonly used psychiatric drug, because this idea that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance was widely believed by most of the general public to have been established, even though most of the people in the profession knew that it hadn't really been established and the research base was actually quite weak. And because I believe that subscribing to this view that depression is a chemical imbalance is not helpful to people.
There's going to be a lot of people listening who are on antidepressants. What should they do?
So I think that people should, if they want to question, if they want to rethink being on antidepressants, if they want to think about the possibility of coming off them, do some reading, discuss it with friends and family, and then go and see their doctors and make a plan to come off their antidepressants slowly and carefully and at the right time.
So don't read your book and just stop.
No, don't read my book and throw the drugs in the bin, because it's very important to say that might make the withdrawal process a lot worse.
What sort of things would happen?
So withdrawal symptoms can be quite severe for some people and prolonged, and it seems that if you come down much more slowly, that's going to make them milder and less likely to be prolonged. Right.
And in terms of the evidence base for talking therapies and other therapies, how good is that? Because what you've done is sort of undermine the evidence base for antidepressants. The question is, how good are the alternatives?
So the evidence is that talking therapies are as good as antidepressants. So if you think
so not very good at all, is what you're saying. They don't work.
So I think that this idea that we're treating a disease is one of the problems, and so it's very unlikely that there'll be something that just works in that sort of medical sense. And therefore, I think we need to see talking therapies as something that might be useful for some people in certain situations, but not in others.
It's quite a bleak outlook you're offering, isn't it? In some ways, because you're basically saying there are some people who are depressed who are just going to be depressed.
No, I'm really not saying that, and I don't think it's a bleak outlook. Most people will get better from depression anyway.
Because you lost your parents as a child and you've had a terrible life as a result, there isn't going to be any social group that the GP can send you to or talking therapy that's going to help you with that.
But giving people antidepressants is giving them false hope, because we really don't have evidence that it might be numbing the pain. It might be numbing the pain, but it's not providing a very satisfactory solution to the problem, I would suggest. And I think it's really important to say most people recover from depression spontaneously without antidepressants. And I think that giving antidepressants to people is actually making that less likely, certainly less likely in the long run. So even though it may be a difficult message at the beginning to say, actually, we don't have a drug that's going to solve this situation, in the long term, I think it's actually a much more hopeful message that you actually have the resources in yourself to deal with this problem.
I mean, that's really interesting if that's true, that most people just feel better spontaneously. So the best advice to a family or friend who comes to you saying they're feeling terrible is you will feel better.
It is to stick it out, and maybe you need some support and some care in the meantime. And to try and work out what it's a response to and change that if it's possible.
Joanna Moncrieff, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.